Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April edition of Word for Word, featuring historical romance author Courtney Milan. Um, my name is Jacob Powers. I'm the Associate Dean of Creative Writing here at SNU. And I'm just honored to introduce Courtney tonight. So Courtney writes books about carriages, horse sets, and smartwatches. Her historical and contemporary romance novels have received starred reviews in Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, and Book List. And she's the New York Times and USA Today bestseller. Before she started writing romance, Courtney got a graduate degree in theoretical physical chemistry from UC Berkeley. After that, just to shake things up, she went to law school at the University of Michigan and graduated summa cum laude. Then she did a handful of clerkships. She was a law professor for a while. She now writes full time and lives in the Rocky Mountains with her husband and an exceptionally perfect dog. Um, Hi, Courtney. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Excellent. That is quite a list of jobs and pursuits. A lot of our students here often wonder, like, how do I find my way through life and stuff to become a writer. So, uh, very exciting to see how all of this comes to fruition in your reading tonight. Do you have anything that you want to say before you jump in, or?
Oh, the short answer to how do you do all that is undiagnosed ADHD for 40 years of my life. Yay.
There you go, everyone. So that's the secret.
That is indeed the secret. Do you want me to jump right into reading or I don't know?
It's totally up to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you plan on reading, or you're happy to
Yes.
give a little? Yep.
Yeah, I'll introduce it and then I'll read from it.
Okay,
I'm
sounds great.
reading from my book, The Duke Who Didn't. This is a very special book for me because it was a little bit of a departure from what I've been writing before. Not a lot of departure, but a little bit of a departure. Um, I am half Chinese. My mother's family came to technically not the United States, but the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii in the early 1870s, 1880s. And a lot of times when you read about Chinese families in fiction, there's an immigration narrative, and it always feels like whatever year you're writing in, that immigration narrative is always there. And I really wanted to write that immigration narrative of my family, which is the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And so this is a book set in Victorian England in the 1890s. And the only thing you need to know that happens before this is that the heroine is named Chloe Fong, and she likes lists, makes lists every day, cares about her lists, and the hero, Jeremy Wentworth, has just startled her so that she has ruined her list, um, which is very bad of him. He will be worse. Okay. It had been 3 years since Jeremy Wentworth, the Duke of Lancing, had last come to Wedgford, and in that time he thought about Chloe Fung and her lists. He thought about her a lot. He'd imagined telling her to put him on her list about 400 times, and had constructed a dozen separate responses from her, ranging from welcoming, not likely, incredibly not likely, to downright devastating. Now he was here, and she was glaring at him. It had been a long time, and yet he recognized her plain gown of ecru muslin from a prior visit. He'd thought about her in this gown, or to be honest, out of it. Often enough, thought about untying the big brown bow of her sash or undoing the buttons down her front. She looked at him with angry, sparking eyes through her spectacles. He had thought his memory of her was crystal clear, but faced with her in the flesh, he could see every point where his recollection had failed. He had forgotten about the silk tassel earrings she wore. Today, little golden fringes dangled from her lobes halfway to her shoulders. He had forgotten about the dimple in her left cheek, the precise black of her hair so much richer in the first rays of sunlight than his memory could reconstruct, the brown beauty spot 3/4 of the way down her neck. God, how had he forgotten that spot? It had once figured so heavily in his imagination. He'd missed her. He'd missed everything about her. She straightened her spine and glared up at him. You are not going on my list. It is my list. I get to make it. Ah, that was good. Just a little minor repudiation. There was hope. He couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. I genuflect to the sovereignty of your list, of course, Jeremy said. Your list is sacred. She turned away from him in one sharp movement and strode back to the house. Chloe had fascinated him from the moment he'd met her. She was a bit more than 2 years his elder and had spotted such a continual air of perfect competence that he'd wondered how it was possible for her to exist. If he had any talent for plain speech, he might have confessed the depths of his feelings by now and obtained her understanding in return. Unfortunately, Jeremy had none. He told her how he felt, but somehow whenever he looked at her, his thoughts never came out as something sober and intellectual like, I respect the things that matter to you. No. Instead, everything he felt got tied up and turned around into, I genuflect to the sovereignty of your list. His words were honestly meant, yes, but the delivery was far less believable. He wished he had a plan for his stupid mouth, but plans were her talent. His, not so much. For now, he followed behind her. After 3 steps, she turned back to him, waving a hand in the air. It's like you've forgotten everything I've ever said to you. Have you made any progress at all, or are you still you? It was as if she'd heard his thoughts. No progress at all, he admitted. I regret to inform you that I will always be me. She exhaled loudly. Have you considered a steady course of continual self-improvement? Tried it, he shrugged. It went about as you'd expect. Don't worry. There's no need to remind me of the charges you laid on me. My memory is like the rest of me, extraordinary. She glared at him. I told you to be serious, and yet here you are. It had been a moonlit night 3 years ago, after the trials had ended. They had both spent the day unsuccessfully attempting to keep another team from crossing a bridge, and then unsuccessfully trying to foil the subsequent victory. Jeremy and Chloe had both been exhausted and frustrated in their team's defeat. Perhaps it had been a mistake, what happened in that particular moment. He'd convinced her to go on a walk with him, and she'd agreed, which had made him feel optimistic. He'd been 20. He had thought himself so very mature, young and full of humor. She had walked beside him, letting him twine his hand with hers. He'd gathered up all his courage. He'd made sure they were hidden from prying eyes, and he'd stopped and leaned in, because he'd known her for almost a decade, and he'd adored her for approximately the same length of time. Perhaps it had been a mistake, but the moonlight had lit the light brown of her skin with silver, and nobody had ever accused Jeremy of engaging in lengthy deliberations prior to action. He had tried to kiss her. She had set a hand on his chest and said exactly this. Jeremy, don't do this unless you can be serious. Be serious. He had known precisely what she meant. It hadn't been a plea for him to stop joking for good. Such a thing would have been impossible, and besides, she liked his jokes. She had wanted him to be serious about her, about them, for 3 minutes, not all of eternity. If Jeremy had been a farmer from Wedgford, on the strength of such encouragement, he would have brought a ring and proposed the next day. But Jeremy was not a farmer. At the time, it had seemed like a fair price to pay for a prize like Chloe, figuring out how to fit her in his life without destroying what he loved best about her. Too bad he'd never succeeded. So here they were, together again. Jeremy had never been one for plans. He just seized the moments that he found. So he did what he did best. He smiled at her. That is precisely what you told me. I remember it well. It turns out that is your list for me, and we've already established that we don't usually get to make each other's lists. She rolled her eyes and started to turn away. I wish I could. If I could make your list, I would. I said usually for a reason. He spread his arms wide, grinning at her. Congratulations. Here I am, to grant your wish. The look she gave him would have proven fatal at a slightly lesser distance than the 3 paces between them. Miss Fong, Jeremy said, thinking as swiftly as he could. As you know, I'm a gentleman of some small amount of property. Yes, she said with a roll of her eyes. You're very wealthy. We all know that. It's why everyone calls you Posh Jim around here. Her nose wrinkled. Congratulations. All your riches must be very nice for you. Jeremy tried not to grimace. He had actually never said that he was very wealthy. He had tried to avoid the topic altogether, but very wealthy was a horrific understatement, and the misunderstanding on the point was entirely Jeremy's fault. Not that he had ever precisely lied. He had just misled, a little. The first year he had come to the village unaccompanied at the age of 12. At the time, it had not seemed prudent to announce to a group of complete strangers that the child who had appeared with no guardian in sight was in fact the very wealthy Duke of Lansing. He'd read books, after all. That was how wealthy dukes who were also children got abducted and held for ransom. So he'd introduced himself as Jeremy Yu. It was not exactly a lie. Yu had been his mother's name, after all, and it was one of his 6 names, not his father's family name. Selectively editing out all his other names? A slip of the tongue. Neglecting to mention his title? It wasn't a lie. He left off all his titles but the one during most of his introductions anyway. Deleting that one was just being selective in his speech or something. The or something had grown. The second year he visited, he'd been having too much fun to ruin it by forcing everyone to become stuffy and bow to him and call him Your Grace. It had been impossible to hide the fact that he had means. His clothing, his accent, his manners, his ability to patronize businesses in Wedgeford, these were all too indicative of his class. But it was easy enough to misdirect. Nobody saw a half-Chinese boy of 13 and thought, by George, that child must be a duke. By the time the 9th year had rolled around, the information he was withholding had become an increasingly awkward weight. He had friends who knew nothing about him. He was in love with a woman who had no idea who he actually was. She had told him to be serious. He had realized he was in love with her and wanted to marry her. Then he had recollected that he was the Duke of Lansing, and she had absolutely no idea. Finally, he'd remembered that his mother had so hated her life as Duchess that she had fled the country with Jeremy in tow, the week his father had been put in his grave. Was that what he was going to offer Chloe? A life she hated? How could he be serious about her under those circumstances? I'm 23, he told the woman he was in love with. Do you know what gentlemen of my age and means are expected to do around the age of 23? Her nose wrinkled. Get in drunken brawls? No, that's 19. At 23, I'm expected to start thinking of marriage. My aunt will not stop bothering me. In point of fact, Jeremy was going to have to figure out what precisely he was going to tell his Aunt Grace. His aunt always wanted what was best for him, but her conception of what was best for her half-Chinese nephew lacked both imagination and experience. She insists that I will have to do almost no work in the matter. She'll find me a few good girls, her words, not mine, and all I must do is give her a list of my criteria. Chloe audibly scoffed at this. My felicitations on your pending nuptials. How lovely for you. You get to pick among the ladies as if you were shopping for apples. Jeremy had never actually shopped for apples. He was nonetheless very certain that the analogy was inapt on several points, the most prominent being that he had his eye on only one apple, and it was her. As I said, I have some means available to me. Chloe's eyes narrowed. You see, this is how you always worm your way in. You're setting up an interesting story, not telling me all the relevant information, and tricking me so that I end up listening to you when I have no intention of doing so. None of this has anything to do with me, and I am excessively busy. So if you don't mind, I will. It has 4 things to do with you. It has 0 things to do with me. 3, as a compromise, Jeremy beamed at her. She let out a pained breath. You may recite 2, but only 2, and then we are finished, utterly finished. Thank you, Jeremy said solemnly. Here's what it has to do with you. I am bad at making lists, and you are exceptionally good at them. She tilted her head. True. I do not, however, see the relevance. We are done. Farewell forever. Second. Absolutely not, Chloe shook her head. That was already 2 things. Your ineptitude at list making and my competence. You don't get a third. We agreed. That was a single thing. Our relative capacity at list making. She let out a huff. You are such a cheat. You have not changed one iota. I do like winning, Jeremy said. It is, as you've noted, an ongoing talent of mine. Stop interrupting. Second, if you were to ask me what qualities I wanted on my list for an ideal spouse, if I wanted a list that best reflected my desires, that list would be a list of your qualities. As soon as he said it, he realized that it was brilliant. Jeremy had 2 problems as he saw it. First, there was the as yet unsolved problem of being a duke. He figured that one out somehow, maybe. But second, and more immediately relevant, there was the problem of Chloe herself. If he had said, Chloe, I want to marry you, she would have thought it a joke and thrown her board at his head. Well, maybe not her board, not with her list attached to it, but she'd have found something else, something like, he glanced at the bottles in her basket. Rather more like that, those would shatter. As it was, she froze in place. She glanced at him through downcast eyelashes. Her voice came out low. My qualities? The problem had never been how serious Jeremy was about her. It had been how serious she thought he was. She had to convince herself first. How better to have her do it than to make a list? He wasn't precisely sure how that would work itself out, but Chloe had always been better at details. Yes, he said, your qualities. If I have to marry someone, it needs to be someone like you. She swallowed. Like me? Yes, Jeremy thought, someone exactly like you in exactly every way. No other woman would do. He nodded. She inhaled and turned away. When she spoke, her voice was very small. I don't think you could pay me to make that list. He hadn't considered that, but actually, now that she mentioned it, it seemed like a good idea. On the contrary, Jeremy grinned at her. I could pay you to do it. Do you wish me to do so? She shook her head. I wouldn't do it for £2. She looked so earnest, saying £2, as if it were an immense and insurmountable sum. Of course she had never thought him serious. The difference in scale between them was massive. For her, £2 was a vast sum. The amount her father might make after working for a few weeks as a chef for hire, and that much only because of his exceptional skill. For Jeremy, £2 was basically nothing. Not for 2. What about 3? She shook her head again, but the shake came more slowly. He should feel bad about bribing her into convincing herself that he was in love with her, but then he'd already spent years trying to figure out how to convince her every other way, and the bribery had mostly been her idea anyway. 4, he offered. Not even for 5. She truly didn't sound convinced. She was as bad at misdirection as Jeremy was good at it. For a moment, he thought about offering her a truly remarkable sum, something that would mean something even to him. 6,000, perhaps. But she'd just roll her eyes and tell him to be serious. 7, then. Not for, she bit her lip, perhaps realizing how many pounds 7 was. She swallowed and looked down. Well, maybe for 7. She glared at him. But you don't really mean to give me 7 entire pounds just to make one fiddly list. That would be obscene. He'd been right to keep the numbers low. If it's a maybe for 7, he said, it's a yes for 10, isn't it? Her lips trembled a moment. I swear a solemn oath on my father's grave. I'll give you 10 pounds, and I'll throw in an entire box of the thickest, creamiest, and most perfect list-making paper that you have ever seen. She shut her eyes. You're not fair. You're never fair. It was only right that he should warn her. I didn't come here to play fair. What did you come here for? There was a simple answer to that. A terrible answer, he knew, but simple. I came here to convince you to marry me, then to tell you who I am, and finally to convince you that you should still marry me anyway, after you realize what a bad bargain I would be. In the end, he misled her with the truth. I came here because I intend to get married. Still she hesitated. She looked away, her shoulders rising and falling with every breath. You'll pay me 10 pounds? You'll sign a contract to that effect? Of course, he said. Make that the first item on our list. Whoever it is I marry must insist I sign contracts. I like that in a woman. All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much for reading that, Courtney. Lots of fans of the dialogue and humor and pacing in the chat as you were reading along there. If you don't mind, I'm going to hop right into the questions, and I just want to let folks know who are here tonight, because I do see a couple of new folks and everything. Welcome. If you do have any questions for Courtney, go ahead and feel free to post them in the chat, and Paul and I will go through it and ask them as we go through. And again, we might combine some questions that are similar in nature just to keep it going. But I'll kick us off. What comes first with your writing, the history or the romance?
You know, I don't know that I can actually separate those two. So I think the way things work for me, I have a terrible way of writing books. And I strongly suggest that if you can write books any other way, you should do that. But when I'm in the initial phases of like having idea turn into like thing that feels like real book, then it's actually a combination of things that happen all at once, right? So I have like this big puddle inside of me that is filled with ideas that don't fit with anything else, right? And some of those things are from history. Like I'll have read a book and in it there was like some idle mention of something that happened a while back, and my brain will be like, ah, what a terrible thing to do to a child. I love it, right? You know, or you'll hear about like, you know, something that happened, like an event that happened, you're like, that would be so really fun to wrap things around, right? And you have these things that sort of like wind up, and at some point you're like, ah, that terrible thing to do as a child works really well if I add it to this historical moment. And then like at some point, like these things start coalescing, and I get a ball, and it's like making a snowman, right? Like you have to have that initial ball to like roll out to make into a snowman. People who live in like non-snowy areas have no idea what I'm talking about, but you have to have that initial like enough of a ball to start rolling it into a story. And so that ball is usually composed of history and characters and a handful of other things. And there's just a moment where it's like these 5 things fit together, and now I'm going to try and wrap a story around it.
So what interested you in history in the first place? Like, I mean, like what gravitates you towards those contexts and stuff that then you then fold into, well, the snowball analogy that you shared with us?
You know, that's a great question. And I have a lot of different answers for it. And some of them they're all true, but some of them are more honest than others. Okay. So one of the things this is sort of like the intellectual, I'm going to give you the intellectual reason first, and then I'm going to give you the honest reason. Okay.
All right, let's
So
hear
the
it.
intellectual reason is this. I actually really love writing in the Victorian era because I feel like in some ways it really mirrors the time when we're living in, right? They were living in an era when their entire world was upended by technology, right? Steamships, telegraph, um, the entire like manufacturing that had never really existed in this particular way. like factories, steam engines, all of these things were coming up, and they were totally changing how life worked for the vast majority of people. You would have these people, and for like century after century, generation after generation, they'd lived in, their dad lived in this village, they lived in this village, and suddenly people were leaving the village, right? They would go to London, they would go to the United States, they would go to, Australia, or they would, travel. Travel was possible, even for people who didn't have a lot of means.
Mhm.
And that meant that people, in some ways, were lonelier than they had ever been before, which I think we can understand now. That people were being uprooted from communities that they had once, um, you know, that had been solid for generations, and what came in the place of those communities was still in flux. I think that's something that a lot of people can understand today. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, the world went from being very, very large to being very, very small, very, very swiftly. And that is something that we also are grappling with today. Not in different ways, but like, you know, we can have conversations with people on the other side of the world. We can see videos made 3,000 miles away, 6,000 miles away, 12, like on the around the moon recently, right?
Yeah.
As
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
happening, like that is something that is both breathtaking and wonderful, and also kind of horrific sometimes, right? And these things that had never happened before, like, if you look at what happened with newspapers in the Victorian era, it's fascinating, right? They go from being something that's like, reporting on every little ridiculous thing that happens in town, to
Mhm.
suddenly, like, you're getting reports on things that happen like across the world, and they happen across the world yesterday, and you can know that, and that's an amazing thing. And so I really feel like, in some ways, the adaptation to change and the fear of that change is something that we have then and now. And so it allows me to tell stories about things that I think matter to us now, but in a safe setting, because we kind of know that it mostly turned out for them, right? We don't know that about us yet. We hope.
Right. Yes. And I
So,
think,
so,
yeah,
so that's my intellectual reason.
that's a
Uh,
great reason. I want to hear the other reason
um,
though.
I mean, I think the other reason is just that I started reading historical romance as a matter of accident, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I actually didn't read romance at all until I was in the middle of grad school at some point. And I started reading romance because there is a science fiction author I liked, Lois McMaster Bujold, who wrote sort of like crossover romance. And one of the things that she did was she recommended that I read a handful of authors. And some of those authors are historical romance authors. And so it started me down the path. And so when I started writing romance, it was a genre that I just read in a lot. And it gave me a great deal of comfort to be living and writing and thinking about a world that had helped me sort of like get through some really hard times.
Well, that's also an amazing response. I think they're both equal in value for sure. I mean, yeah, I was kind of blown away by your comparison of the Victorian era to the contemporary era, and I think it's also helpful because creating that distance makes it feel less lectury, right? Or less of a like, hey, a warning sign of like, here's where it's happening right now. Don't you all see what's happening with AI and everything? It's like, well, let's take it back in time to what was happening
Hmm.
earlier, and how did that turn out? It ended up turning out okay-ish. I mean, we're all still here, so
Hmm.
humanity survived in some way. But I love
So
your other
far.
response as well. Yes, so far. Let's just keep fingers crossed on this.
So
Um,
far. Let's keep going.
Right. But I love your other response too. I mean, getting using literature or reading just to get through times and stuff like that is just something that I always try to preach to all of our our students and everything here at SNU. So thank you so much. Paul, I see a lot of questions already coming through in the chat.
Yes, it's,
Do you wanna share a couple while I hand
yeah,
over to you? All right.
I'll grab one out of the chat here that I saw earlier. Let's see here. Here we go. This first one I saw, kind of aligns with a question that we had already prepared, actually. So can you talk a little bit about your organizational process when writing your stories? Do you usually have a strong outline? Do you let your creativity flow? Are you a plotter, a pantser? And I guess I also wanted to tack on to that the question about, is one approach or the other better for writing romance novels? And if so, why do you think?
Okay, so I'll start with the last question first.
Okay.
I don't think there is a wrong or right way to write. I think there is a matter of finding out how your brain works best and finding your process. And I feel like anyone who tells you that there is a process and you must follow it does not have your best interest at heart. You are writing your books. Your books belong to you and you alone. And the way that your brain comes about making things up is actually a significant portion of what will make your book special. That's just my experience. I have tried, my process sucks. I've said this before. I have tried to make it a better process and it does not make a better book. It just means that I end up having to do a lot of work at the back end of things because I think about things. I am not a plotter. I don't really think I'm a pantser either. I write significantly out of order. And so what I do is, I mentioned before, I have my little snowball. My snowball is history, romance, characters, and then like a couple key scenes in the books. And I honestly don't know how I get to those scenes or where they come from. I just know that at some point in the book, she's going to sit down and she's going to be doing this thing, right? And so the thing that I will do is I will write that scene first. I don't know
Mhm.
how the characters meet. I don't know anything about them. I don't know who their parents are. I write that scene. And when I'm writing that scene, it jogs things, right? I start writing stuff down and he's writing that scene and like I'll just put in something there because I'm like, why is he doing this? I don't know. I've never met this guy before, right? Why is he doing this? And so I write in there, you know, well, his mother's really going to hate that. And I'm like, great, he has a mother, right? His mother doesn't like this, right? And then I have to go through and I'm like, what's his relationship with his mother? And so I'll write another scene that sort of fleshes that out. It's not plotting, it's not pantsing. Uh, I sometimes will write the end of the book first and then try and figure out how I'm getting there. Sometimes
Mhm.
I will write a scene in the middle and try and figure out how I'm getting there. And it is a terrible process because once you finish, right? And finish is once you finish a first draft, essentially what has happened at this point is that I've nailed down all the key scenes, but I still have to go back and because I'm sort of like stumbling through the dark and stubbing my toe against like all the hard edges of the story. I then have to go back and like do a ton of editing to make things consistent to try and figure out why people are doing things because I'll have them to be doing like different things from like scene 1 to scene 2 to scene 3 and then I have to go and make it all consistent and figure out how does this actually work in a human being. Terrible way to do things. It is my way.
Do you use beta readers or editors to help you with that stage of things?
I have an editor who I trust implicitly who reads the first draft of my stories. I don't trust a lot of people to do that because uh, at the point when I have a first draft, it's not always clear what the story is, and
Mhm.
I don't want. So here's one of my problems. Okay, so know yourself is actually really important. I'm extremely demand avoidant. So if you tell me to do something, I will automatically don't not want to do it. And so I actually have to be very careful about letting people tell me not to do things because if they tell me to do something obvious, or something that I really need to do, I won't want to do it. Right. And so I have an editor who understands me very well and who will do the thing that I need, which is to say, here's what's not working for me. Here's the parts that I'm thinking don't really fit together. And she doesn't tell me what to do, right?
Mhm.
She'll tell me what's not working and why the book is broken. In fact, when I send her the book, I usually preface it with like 3 pages of me writing something saying, this is why this book is broken. And that the act of writing that out for me is actually super important because it helps me clarify what I'm working on for the next draft. And what she does is she reads what I've said and she goes back and sometimes she will say, I think you're being too hard on yourself. This subplot is working really well. And sometimes she will come back and say, you are dead on. This thing is broken. And I think you will find that this other thing next to it is broken and they're broken together. And so maybe you need to think about fixing them together. So
Mhm.
that's kind of how things work in the editing process for me.
Yeah, that's great feedback, by the way. That's super
It is.
useful, that sort of stuff. As you were talking about I mean, I loved your analogy with the snowman, like Jacob did, because it's such a uh, organic description of the process. But at the same time, your later description of the way that you work struck me as being so logical. I mean, it's not logical in the sense that you start at point A and end up at point Z, but it's logical in the sense that you're applying a certain manner of thought right? A certain approach to figuring out like what the connection between these things are, what the backstory of your characters might be, all that sort of thing. You proceed by almost like a process of deduction. So is that, I mean, do you feel kind of like when you're writing something, are you excavating something that already exists in some form? You're just discovering what the connections are that are already there, or are you imposing connections that already that didn't exist until you sort of created them?
Can I pick a third option?
Yes.
Okay. So I think sometimes there's excavation and sometimes there is imposing. But I think more than that, like I think so part of what you're doing when you do this is you're telling yourself a story, right? Like, and I think a first draft is very much but when you get to the final draft, you're telling a story to someone else.
Right.
When you're writing the first draft, you're telling a story to yourself, right? And very often I have found that the story that I'm telling to myself at that time is a story that I need to hear, right? And so a lot of what I'm doing in that moment is going through and sort of like forcing myself to figure out where I'm uncomfortable with the story and making myself lean into it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I don't think that I'm excavating a story. I don't think I'm making connections. I feel like I'm finding the part of me that is going to be reflected in the story already. So there is something pre-existing, but the thing that is pre-existing in some sense is me.
Yeah. Jacob, you want to take it over?
Yeah,
Another few questions. Thank you for
yeah,
that
sure.
answer, by the way.
Actually, we have a question from one of our instructors here at SNU, Misty Urban, who, if I'm not mistaken, also writes historical romance novels too. And she was actually quite asking how you feel about tweaking historical facts or details to help fit the story that you want to tell. How do you approach that process? Because I know it varies by writer.
Okay, that's a great question. I think it depends on the historical fact or detail, right? So there's some things that I feel fine tweaking, and I think that the question. So look, one thing I want to say right off the bat, I'm writing fiction, so all of this didn't happen. Like none of this happened. All of this is a tweak of historical fact or fiction, right? There are some underlying things that are questions of like the world that you live in, right? So as an example, when was the telegraph invented? Right? That is a question that if I got it wrong, or if I put the telegraph in a book where the telegraph hadn't been invented yet, I think that I feel weird about that, right? You're writing historical stuff for a reason. Why are you changing the historical record? There are exceptions to that, of course. And the exceptions are when your fiction needs to change the world as a part of the story, right? So, as an example, in my Brother Sinister series, the Countess Conspiracy, the entire premise of the book is that there has been a character in the book who has been making scientific discoveries, and the scientific discoveries around the science of inheritance. This happens right around the time that Gregory Mendel is actually doing his work on the science of inheritance. The inheritance of traits, like through like he used peas, I think. And my character finds them through snapdragons, and has to actually find it backwards because snapdragons have a different inheritance scheme than peas. Not really relevant, right? But nobody actually did that, right? But the results of me doing this is that people actually. So the other thing about Gregory Mendel is you have to understand he published these papers and like nobody saw them for like 20 years, and he was only credited with it after the fact when people were like, "Oh, this explains so much. We just found this stuff." Right? So instead, my character is doing it up front and openly at the same time. So now I am, in fact, changing the history of science, but it's happening because of a character in the story, and that is a driver of the story. Right. And so that I think is totally fair game to essentially create your characters are already creating an alternate universe that they live in. Right. If your character changes the world that they're living in through the operation of their thing, then I think that that's totally fair game. Right. Another example, people are like, oh, well, there were no Chinese dukes. I don't care. Like, that's not, I mean,
Right.
like none of the dukes that people write historical romances about actually existed, right?
Mhm.
Like, people have written dukes who were all like all the dukes in England are now part of a sex club. That didn't happen, Well, actually, it kind of did. Never mind that. Not a great example. It turns out that all the dukes were abstaining before there was an Epstein. Let's leave that one out. But like there's all these things that they people have happened that haven't actually happened in real life. I think it's totally fine to invent characters who are doing things that didn't happen at the time, as long as it makes sense within the time period that they are in, if that makes sense. Can you explain it? Or is it just like, oh wow, a magic fairy came and now there's like a giant new laser that they're all using. Congratulations on the rediscovery of the laser before they knew about it.
Yeah. Do you often find, like, do you ever get people writing to you with those types of like, well, actually emails like this didn't exist historically and stuff like that? Is that something that you have to navigate as a writer? Because I'm
Sometimes they
just
do, but
thinking of
they're
my
always
uncle.
wrong. Like,
Yeah.
here's the thing.
Oh, are they always
I
wrong?
actually,
They don't even know the
I
history.
actually know. There's some things in my story that I do tweak just because it's boring. As an example, I use the word suffragette because I just think this word suffragist is ugly. I don't like using the word suffragist, and I've used the word suffragette sometimes, and whatever choice. They didn't use the word suffragette at the time. I don't care. I prefer one word over the other, right?
Yeah.
And no one has ever called. I think one person has called me on that in all of time, right? So there's a couple of things that I have tweaked like that. But the things that they get mad at me for are things that are just not. They're just not a thing. They're like, oh, well, people back then didn't swear. Oh, yes, they did, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just ridiculous stuff. Or women back then wouldn't be caught alone walking with a man. And I'm like, have you read Jane Austen? Yes, they did. Yes, they did. They absolutely did that, right? Or women back then didn't know anything about sex. And I'm like, they had friends, okay? Like, yes, they didn't have a concerted sex education program. And I'm not saying that they knew everything, but you're telling me that nobody ever taught them anything until their wedding night. That's just not true, right? And it's not true because you have these etiquette books that tell women what not to do. And that list provides them a lot of information of things that you might want to try if you were, a certain kind of person. They wouldn't be telling people not to do it if nobody ever did it, right? The things that nobody ever does don't end up in the etiquette books.
So it sounds like mostly people were reaching out because of their own moral dilemmas or ethical dilemmas, more so than history. It was like, well, it was better back then because they weren't doing those things. Like, yes, they were.
Yeah. I mean, I get a lot of, well, they didn't have people of color in England back then. And I'm like, yeah, they did. They really did. Sorry about that. Sorry to burst your illusion, but it's never been a white haven. Never.
You wonder if
the Romans brought people in.
I wonder if the creators of Bridgerton also get similar emails and messages about that.
Oh, well, Bridgerton is in a different story. Like, Bridgerton is officially building an AU of Regency England. I think somebody called it the Recency instead of the Regency. And I think that's very accurate. Like, they try to do it. Like, they have the little like orchestras playing like modern music on their violins and stuff. Like, they're specifically
so like a purposeful choice.
Yes, correct. They're purposely saying we are not Regency England. We are like Regency England.
Yeah.
Moved about 45 degrees from reality.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Paul, did you
People still get mad about it though?
Do they?
Yeah, because, but I mean,
yeah.
But why would you care if you're them? Like, you're
I don't know.
Popular show, like, people love your show, and some people are like, how dare you get the Regency details mad? And that just makes everyone else say, sure, we love it, goodbye, you don't have to watch it.
I mean, that's what I was kind of curious about, because like people who read historical romance fiction are reading it specifically for the historical romance aspect of it. They're not reading it to historical. It's not David McCullough. Like, they're not like, I'm reading this to learn about the history of that time period. Mm-hmm. So like to approach any type of writing that way and say, well, actually, and stuff seems, give a book a life, I guess. Like, just enjoy the book story and read it and stuff. So, excellent. Paul, did you have another question that you wanted to ask from the chat, or should I pull one from ours?
No, let me just grab one out of my own head.
Okay.
because I guess what this is making me think about is you began your career with a traditional publisher, and then you moved over, and in fact, you were one of the first writers to kind of demonstrate that it was possible to have a successful career in self-publishing. Um, so I guess what I'm wondering is, like, in traditional publishing still, the romance genre, perhaps almost more than any other genre, has very rigid strictures that publishers expect writers to follow. And I'm assuming that as a self-published writer of romance, you don't have to follow those strictures as closely. So can you talk about that a little bit about is romance opening up in the sense of like the freedom to address things in a more I don't know, less historically bound way, one might say.
So I think actually that self-publishing has opened up the romance genre a lot. And I can see a huge difference between when I started my career and where I am now, right? So as an example, um, one of the reasons why I started self-publishing, there were many reasons. One of them is I hate being told what to do. I think I've mentioned that. And I had my publisher was like, well, we love your writing, but your characters are so weird. Can you just write normal characters? And I'm thinking to myself, no, I
Yeah.
don't even think I know how to do that. Like,
What does that
was like,
even
what do you,
mean? What is a normal
I mean, like
character?
all of my characters are like giant weirdos, and there's a reason for that. I don't know how to write a normal character. It would suck. Like, what do normal people, what are they even like? I've been trying my entire life, like being like, normal people, why are you doing that? Why are you, it's so weird. I don't get it, right? How am I supposed to write a more normal person? I don't know. All I know how to do is write big giant weirdos. So like, anyway, they were like, well, why are your characters so weird? And I was like, because I'm weird, that's why. And so I started self-publishing in part because of these conversations where they were like, maybe just have her write characters that are more traditional, less weird, less named things like Smite. I was like, but I love the name Smite. You can't tell me not to name. Anyway, so I started because I just really felt like I was being compressed into a little ball and told to write specific things. And so I didn't write those specific things, and I did way better on my own than I did with them. Like they were just not marketing me well because they kept trying to put me like, I don't have a copy, thankfully, of my second book, but it's like I wrote this book where the guy is like depressed and his wife is going around the country and like saving abused women from their husbands by like having them run off. And they gave me this cover where the girl is like lying on a bed, and the guy is like looking straight into the camera, like he just roofied her. And I'm like,
No.
this is not going to sell the book. Like, this is going to sell a different book. And people are going to pick it up and it's going to be like, and here's the hero struggling with depression. Ha ha ha. Like it's just not the right cover for this book. Right. And so I feel like I've been able to do a better job of packaging and presenting myself than that they were able to do, just because they kept trying to put me into this old box. And I didn't fit in that box. And I think just being more honest about who I was and what I was doing was way more successful for me.
Because you reach those readers, right? Because readers can tell when
Yeah.
a writer's being authentic or
Yeah.
not, right? And suddenly you reached all those weirdo readers out there who are just
Yeah.
looking to read about other weirdos.
Yeah.
And
I actually think people want weirder characters.
Yeah.
Like, if you write characters and they're just like normal, then like you don't stand out.
Right.
Nobody
Well, I mean,
you read a book and then you're like nobody remembers it like 10 years later because it was that book with a normal guy.
well, look at the Duke who didn't. I mean, well, I don't want to say the whole plot revolves around this, but a very substantial portion of the plot is all engaged with the fact that your protagonist really loves to make lists. And not only loves to make them, but like it's an integral part of who she is as a person and what she does every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not, so to speak, normal. You know what I mean? If you were trying to write a normal character, you would that would not be at the top of the list, so to speak. And the whole book would be out the window.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, the book didn't work until I had her start the book writing a list, and I was like, ah, I know who she is now. This is great.
Ah,
But
interesting.
until I figured out how she was weird, the book just was
Yeah,
not working. It was like, it's like you have this gear and you're trying to turn the gear and like it's
yeah.
missing teeth. That was a missing tooth.
So do you have a moment like that with every character where suddenly you're like, ah, now I understand who this character is?
No, no, no. Sometimes I have to fight the whole way with a missing gear, and you're just like,
Mhm.
I'm gonna make it work. I gotta make it work. I haven't found the thing. And sometimes there just is no thing, and you just have to you're fighting it the whole way.
Yeah.
Like some books are a fight, and some books are simple. That's just how it
Mhm.
is.
So the theme that I'm getting out of this is, writing with confidence and doing, pursuing the
Yeah.
goals that you want to pursue rather than
Hmm.
feeling boxed in, which I think is a great
Yeah.
message for all of our students and stuff. I constantly try to
Yes.
tell them that, like, read across genres, write what you want to write, write it with that confidence though. And I think I would like to try to tie a couple of these questions that we have in the chat together here
Hmm.
and stuff, because you were talking about your weird characters and everything. And there are a couple questions because a lot of people were commenting on how great the dialogue is in the excerpt that you read. So how do you come to creating those weird characters? Do you start with the dialogue? Do you, like, in your head picture these two talking and bantering back and forth to reveal themselves, or are there other ways in which you work on developing the character? I know that you just mentioned that sometimes there's that missing cog that, like, you're like not quite
Hmm.
sure where it comes into place and stuff. So, like, how does that come to fruition for stories like that you enjoy writing?
Uh, I don't know.
Okay, fair
I,
enough.
I I wish I had a better answer to that. I can give a
Yeah,
slightly more involved answer, but I
yeah,
don't actually know how a lot of this stuff happens.
yeah.
I think I'm like dialogue is something that I have been good at. Like when I first started writing, there were a lot of things I needed to work on, but dialogue was always sort of one of my strong points. And I think part of it is that I'm from a very large family, and we are like nitpicky and weird and like our like if you're ever around us, like our events are always sort of like full of this like constant conflicts and like pushy stuff, and so it just comes very naturally to me.
Okay, so it kind of still aligns with just like go with what you want to write, and then it'll kind of come to
Yeah.
fruition on its own rather than.
Yeah.
um okay, nice. So in general, like, because I think one of the things that often comes with romance. I have a lot of students who like to try to
Hmm.
they're writing in the romance genre.
Yeah.
Not as many with historical, though. I did have a gunslinger story that I read this year, or this term, in one of my classes and stuff,
Hmm.
which was kind of fun. But
Yeah.
one of the major things with, like, romance in any kind is like that emotional output and putting it in, having that as a part of the narrative. How do you balance that output with, like, that physical intimacy um, in your writing? I know that some romance writers go further, obviously,
Yeah.
some allude. Like, how do you find that right balance for your own writing?
I mean, I think the answer is different for every person, and again, I think this comes down to what feels natural for you and what feels natural for the story. Like, I actually think I have different stories that have slightly different heat levels because it just depends on what the characters are. Like, some people, they're just not gonna snap into it right away, right? There's just too much going on for them to be physically intimate. And others, it just feels like it's really natural to have them sort of like almost nearly immediately have that physical connection. Um, in terms of balance, I don't I don't know that it is a balance, right? Like I think that thinking of it, I guess one way I would say is that say it as this. Sex is part of the plot, right? You're not
Mhm.
it's like you're not balancing part of the plot with the characters and all that other stuff. It is the plot, right? Like the characters and the plot are like they're like, warp and weft in the fabric you're weaving in the story. So um it it's not it's I think balance isn't the right framework that I use when I'm thinking about
Mhm.
it. It's a matter of finding the right place for it to happen.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Paul, did you have another question? And
Yeah,
or
I mean,
I should say, folks, if you also have questions,
oh
I
yes,
see.
please.
Please do post them. I'm loving all the comments. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong. The comments are all great too, but if you have any other questions, don't hesitate
and
to post them.
and like we said at the outset, Courtney, this event is going by like that. I mean, we've got
Yeah,
closing in,
I know.
closing in.
I just looked at the clock and I was like, what?
Exactly. So before we get to the end, um, let me ask you this really quick. This is something that's come up in the chat as well. And I don't mean to open a whole can of worms or anything, but like, what is the impact that you see on the romance genre and on writing in general and on writers in general of AI right now?
So a couple of different things. First of all, I do not think AI, and I do not think this generation of AI will ever be able to write a novel that compares to a really good human writer. I just don't think it's possible for a number of reasons based on how the technology works, right? The technology is looking for correlations between words. It can put together things, but what it's very bad at is long-term continuity and human emotion. And those are the two things that are sort of like the bread and butter of romance. I think the way that it's impacting the industry is unfortunately really hard for entering writers, right? Because it means that there are tens of thousands of books out there. Like somebody can produce a book and have it look like a competent book and put it on the digital shelves. And when you have somebody putting out 400 or 500 books a year, and you have not just one person doing that, but you have 1,000 people doing that, it drowns out new authors.
Yeah,
And I think that's a huge problem, right?
yeah,
Not that they can write better than you, but they can simply exist in such greater numbers that you might never be found in this much larger sea that is being made. So that is, I think, the threat that it poses. I think the bigger threat that is being posed right now is actually like that people aren't reading as much, and I think that that's a problem.
mhm,
Um, and that kids graduating from high school today are not being taught to read in the same way that I was. Like the reading, the grade level of reading of a high school graduate has gone down since I was a kid, and that's terrifying to me because I think reading is so like it's been such an important part of my life, obviously, and I think it's probably an important part to everyone here. And having fewer people who are readers is going to impact the market. So that's kind of what I see as the issue here. The drowning out of voices is a huge problem. And I've always said this before. Like I actually think like people sometimes will talk about my fellow authors and they're like, well, isn't that your competition? And the answer is almost never, oh yeah, she's my competition, right? Like Tessa Dare, um, Julia Quinn, like all of these people, if somebody reads a good historical romance novel, do you know what they want to do next? They want to read another one, right?
mhm.
And people get on a kick. They're like, I love these books about such and such, and they want to read like 18 of them. They're not your competition. They're your catalyst, right? The thing that is your competition is bad books. If somebody reads a bad book, they don't want to read another book. They're like, this is not a fun activity. My brain doesn't like it. Let me go watch a video instead, right? Your competition is bad books, and there are so many bad books being produced right now. That is going to have an impact on reading. So that's kind of my
Yeah,
spiel on how I think AI is going to impact the market. I don't think it's good for us, but probably not in the sense that AI is going to be able to create a good book just like me. No, it never will.
yeah.
It never will. We need a different technology for that. The technology we have right now is not capable of that.
Let me ask one more question out of the chat here. I think this is an important question.
Yeah.
Um, I'm trying to figure out writing the romantic subplot for my asexual protagonist, romance without sex. How do you handle, and I know there are writers that do asexual
Mm-hmm.
romances. So how do you do that?
That is a great question. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give the best answer for it, but certainly romance without sex is extremely possible because there are people that have romances without sex. So you're dealing with someone who's ace but not aromantic, right? Um, and like, what is what is it that I guess the thing I would be looking for in this in this equation is what is their love language, right? What is it that you do to convince someone that the romance is there? I do have to say, like, I think sex, when it exists in books, is an important part of the book. But it is not the only important part. And if all you had was the sex, it would not feel like a romance, right? The things that make up a romance are often those small little things, like someone noticing that you're having a bad day and doing something about it, someone understanding who you are, seeing who you are, and caring about that person and wanting to be with you. That is romance, right? That is the core of romance right there. That includes sex for some people, but it doesn't have to. I think the core of romance doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with sex. You just have to know what it is that the characters do for each other. And it, for many people, it's not sex.
Mhm.
And in fact, I think for most people who you would think to be as like a really good couple, the sex, even if it is there, is not the entirety or even a small portion of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, you kind of think of it as, or maybe it's our culture that teaches us to think of, there's no sex in your book. Well, what's that you think of it as something missing, right? Like how can I put sex into my book? It belongs there, but who says? Maybe it doesn't.
Doesn't have to be there.
Yeah.
Totally doesn't.
I think there just continues to be barriers broken down or an expansion of multiple genres and stuff that kind of just embrace that idea, right? Because I think it is a stereotype or cliche where it's like, oh, the romance novel is going to be, it's like the 50 Shades of Grey idea, like picking up the paperback at the grocery store kind of thing. It's like, that's not how it is now. It's quite different. Like there are a variety of, I mean, again, not to look ahead, but like what Chuck Tingle writes as well. And stuff like there's all kinds of markets to explore, and I think that again just folds in so beautifully with the theme again that I'm just going to say again tonight is just like write with confidence and write what you love and just pursue that and find your community. Those are all really great points that I think were shared tonight, and I just really appreciate your time with us, Courtney. Again, the hour always goes by so quickly. But we had a really fun time.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. This was great. It's just so much fun. I enjoyed talking with everyone.
And
yes, well, thank you.
I'm sorry, Jacob. Go ahead.
Nope, you're all set, Paul. Go ahead.
I was just going to remind people that 5 lucky attendees tonight will win a copy of The Duke Who Didn't, and you're in for a real treat if you haven't read it already. And Jacob just put the link to Courtney's website into the chat. Pay her a visit and learn more about her. We'll be back next month with our special guest, Chuck Tingle. Very excited about that. And Courtney was telling us beforehand that she knows Chuck. And
I haven't met him. I've talked with Chuck.
Yeah.
I know. I've been in Chuck's.
I mean, it's closer to the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, so
Chuck
we'll take it. I mean,
Chuck wrote a Tingler about my experience with RWA, so I
will
love Chuck forever.
Okay, interesting.
And Courtney, we got through the whole conversation without bringing up the RWA at all.
That's true, we did.
So
yeah,
I guess that's
anyway
some kind of record. All right, so thank you again. Best of luck with what's next for you, Courtney, by the way.
I'm actually writing a contemporary fantasy.
Oh, cool.
Which is, people are like, oh, a romantasy. And I'm like, it's a romantasy about private equity set in Pueblo, Colorado. So this is going to be exactly what the market wants.
Well, it sounds
there will
weird.
be a market.
So
I'm sure there will.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Courtney, and thank you all for joining tonight. We really appreciate it. I know midweek Wednesdays at 8 o'clock Eastern Time can be a struggle for some, but we always appreciate you coming to visit us. Stay tuned for future Word for Word events. And Courtney, we hope you have a wonderful night, and thank you again for joining us.
You as well. Thank you so much. This was great.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.